to 5 minutes, that would be brilliant.
5 minutes.
Thank you.
Okay. Bueno, me toca romper el hielo. Buenos días.
So I have to break the ice. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and to be part of a panel with our comrades from the parliamentary group of the Socialists and Democrats. Thank you to you for the invitation too. It's a pleasure to be here, engaging in interregional dialogue. I'm going to pick up from what you said about the opportunities and the priorities at a regional level. And I'd like to begin with the description that Latin America needs Europe and Europe needs Latin America. When we're talking about strategic alliances between Europe and Latin America, that applies to trade and development, and we have to recognize that we share values and common objectives. Defending democracy, respect for human rights, promoting multilateralism and sustainability. However, we also need to go on translating those priorities into hard and fast action that allows our societies to fully live those out. This interregional cooperation between these two blocks requires progressing transformative cooperation for people, democracies and the planet on an intergenerational basis for juster and more sustainable and resilient societies. So how do we set about these alliances? They must be multi-actor and multi-level, as mentioned in the panel. Bringing together public authorities with the private sector, development banks, charitable associations, the academic world and local organizations to work collectively and on a participatory basis to drive forward the 2030 agenda in the territories covered by the 2030 plus agenda, working together with parliaments as a nerve centre here, representing society. We must work on rights and opportunities. Democracy has room for improvement, of course, we know that, and we need to improve it as a system. We see international cooperation as vital, particularly on a triangular basis, with technology transfer and developing capabilities being vital parts of this. The speaker's being asked to slow down. And this applies to high income countries such as Uruguay as well. We must develop capabilities on an ongoing basis. Latin America has a lot to offer Europe. The region is an example of good practice and policy that can be shared horizontally, with more regions being beneficiaries. In this context, what are these priorities? Well, first, to ensure that there's a green transition and a digital and cooperation transition too. Europe and Latin America are facing the same challenge to be more productive and more sustainable with low emissions and more productive efficiency. We must be a model for a fair and sustainable form of development, and that involves capacity building too. Here I should mention that Uruguay is working on climate change with an innovative financial instrument that provides a good structure for financing, combating climate change. And that's what was promised under the Paris Agreement. Also, the financing of public debt is important. The World Bank has said that there should be a reduction in interest rates for projects intended to improve environmental and climate factors. These objectives must be part of what we're doing. We must also work on reducing duties as part of the trade agenda. Trade isn't just about figures of commercial interchange. It's all about human rights too. People need decent, gender equal, well-paid work. and small and medium-sized enterprises must be part of the focus too. The speaker again is being asked to slow down. These companies account for most of the employment in the region, so we must have policies focused on alliances and agreements supporting those actions. We must ensure that there is access to trade markets on an equal basis. We must build confidence as well. As I mentioned in the introduction, there's geopolitical fragmentation and tension in trade terms with increasing protectionism, and there's also equality crises and climate change crisis. Multilateralism is being ignored. In trade terms, Latin America and Europe have a common interest in getting this message out again that we need a just approach to protect public goods. This has to be based on the values that unite us, a multilateral approach to challenges, abiding by international agreements. One additional point. All democracies can be improved, and both regions share the need for political trust and trust in high-quality institutions. This cannot be reduced to technical or financing questions, this cooperation. There must be a political dialogue at a high level that recognises these asymmetries. And we must come up with a common recognition of the challenges and solutions. It's not just about trade, but about promoting development, democracy and human rights in the relationship between Latin America and Europe.
Martin, ya conectando también la próxima sesión. Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you, Martin. That's a link with the next session too. So thank you for those first thoughts.
A ti.
And now it's you, Luis, for you to share your vision with us too of how the priorities should shape up in common for the trade relations between Latin America and Europe.
Gracias por la...
Good morning, and thank you for inviting me here. Following on from what Martin said, who gave a perspective from Uruguay, I'm going to broaden the framework a little bit, and I wanted to try and provoke a debate, really, so that we can have that back and forth, that exchange. I think one of the main opportunities that we have is to strengthen the political dialogue and cooperation between the EU and Latin America. We need to address a lot of the challenges that we're facing right now regarding peace, security, and democracy. I also wanted to mention how we promote trade and sustainable development. We need to promote sustainable development that is linked to the reduction of poverty, because that combination is very important. The just and green transition is also incredibly important in Latin America. We need to promote energy efficiency, renewable energy, and a reduction of greenhouse gases. And another topic that I think is quite developed here is the digital and inclusive, the digital transition, which needs to be inclusive. We need to provide training and preparation for people to accept this in Latin America. Social cohesion through investments in health, social protections and education, and of course, investment in sustainable infrastructure. I wanted to end by mentioning a topic that we often don't pay much attention to, which I believe is important. How do we strengthen citizens' participation and the participation of civil society in general? We need to include citizens in decision-making and in economic issues. They are often excluded from the important debates. This is just a very general overview and me giving my perspective on the region. I've mentioned some of the aspects which I think are important and that we should prioritize and try and create opportunities around that. Thank you. Thank you very much. Luis? Thank you for broadening the context a little bit. Anna?
I was speaking in English, then I switched to Spanish. Sorry for
No worries.
I will continue in English. From your perspective, Anna, so what common priorities then you see? There's already a lot been mentioned, but what's your views,
Thank you very much for your introduction. I'm very happy to be here in this panel with you all guys. And I'm going to switch into Spanish once we have interpretation. Y bueno, daros los buenos días a todos.
So I wanted to welcome you all here and start this panel by thanking Leire Pagin, who was born to clearly lead. I'm personally very close to her, but I think from a professional perspective, she's unbeatable. She's created these incredible events and invited very important guests. That's not an easy thing to do, especially given our workload, and also because she's the Secretary General and she has a huge amount of work to do. So thank you very much for organizing these interesting events. Thank you for all your work. And thank you to the other MEPs who are here today. I also wanted to thank Mr. Mercadante for being here with us today. So when it comes to the relationship with Latin America, for us it's very important. These events, these Latin American days, haven't been organized by chance. We have MEPs who are fighting to really consolidate that relationship we have with Latin America. Leire is the Vice President of Eurolat. Javi Lopez, in his worked on the most recent report and described some of the most important topics that affect Mercosur and the EU-Latin America relationship. And it's important that people understand that this parliament is important because a lot of what we do happens because we vote here. We vote on them in this space. So we're not just the European Parliament, and what we vote on affects European citizens, but a lot of the European treaties that govern the relationship we have with other countries are signed here. So we actually have a more important role than you might think. The relationship and that alliance we have with Latin America is crucial, and we've been working hard on this. This year and next year are particularly important. There are lots of elections taking place in Latin America, and so we have to consider our political positioning and our positioning from a trade perspective as well. Honduras, Chile, Colombia, Brazil, where we are very hopeful because of the government that's in place right now. Then we have a really important economic relationship with Latin America and a trade relationship that is crucial. Our trade relationship is worth 395 million euros. We're leaders in direct investment in Latin America. Around 41 billion has been committed to investments until 2022. And we could even go further than that. At the moment, we are modernizing some legal instruments. In particular, we are modernizing the agreement we have with Mexico. That's being updated. It's going very well. And for us, it's really important that that gets implemented. One of the most important priorities that we have here is the Mercosur agreement. That is key. It opens us up to a market of over 700 million people. It's a major priority for us, and we hope that it's signed as soon as possible. There are other things we could mention, but Mercosur for us is key. If we talk about the updated agreement with Mexico, some of the priorities that we have established are as follows. We want to fight against corruption. We want sustainable development, respecting the Paris Agreement, a joint statement on trade and gender equality. We'll also be supporting consent as well. In Mercosur, we have drawn up a text which I think is quite accessible and I think is acceptable for everyone. We've done a lot of work on the impact on the different economic sectors, and I think that's very positive. We've brought people here to talk about the concerns that they might have so that they can explain the relevance of the agreement and how beneficial it could be from an economic perspective. It will benefit manufacturing in the livestock sector. It will strengthen the economic fabric of the region, and for us it's definitely a win-win situation. Another important topic that we're developing with Latin America, and I don't want to go on for too long because I'm also in the group on raw materials, we're trying to boost the sustainable development agenda in the best way possible. We have talked about key critical raw materials, which is important for Latin America. In Latin America, we have some of the most important raw materials necessary for a clean transition: nickel, cobalt, copper, are found in Latin America as well as in Chile, Bolivia have 70% of the world's reserves of lithium, for example, but Mexico also has silver and copper, and rare earths can also be found in Brazil. It's one of the few countries that hold these rare metals. And so we want to invest in sustainable value chains that are regulated and offer added value at local level. We have signed memorandums of understanding on critical raw materials with Argentina and Chile specifically. And I'm going to stop here. We want to continue to broaden our relationship with the region. There are key instruments like Global Gateway with pillars like the green just transition. London already talked about the digital transformation and transition as well, and how we want to promote access to vaccines and health resilience. These are all very positive aspects, but this isn't enough. We need to go further. I'm going to stop now because I don't want to go on for too long, but as you can see, we have very specific action plans that are part of our relationship with Latin America, and we will continue to work on them. S&D will continue to strongly support all the agreements that will improve the trade and economic relationship between us. We will also focus on the human side of things as well, because we have a very strong emotional bond with Latin America. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias a ti, Ana.
Thank you very much, Anna, too, for those very tangible references.
The trade relationship can also be conducive to something else. It is not just economic development. You made reference to very concrete clauses, anti-corruption, gender equality. So this is really a huge ambition. And, great thanks, for bringing this house this ambition of going beyond just, mere economic relationship. I'd like to now keep deepening our exchange. So I return to you, Martín Clavijo, asking if, given your professional experience and considering the priorities of your country, of Uruguay, what do you think are the most significant opportunities and benefits of deepening this EU and Latin American relationship?
Bien.
Right. Well, I noted 4 priorities, but I would emphasize 2, which I think are important. One, Anna mentioned, the other, Luis. Firstly, the opportunity that we have with this agreement to generate just sustainable, diversified values. The digital transition and AI are redefining the world economy. Europe needs access to minerals and clean energy, as Anna mentioned. Latin America, for its part, needs investment, knowledge transfer, and so on. And this transfer is vital to sustainable alliances that will allow a long-term vision and help us promote clean, competitive industry. Uruguay is a case in point where we're promoting an inclusive society in terms of the global gateway with the EU. and we're trying to lay down the social and gender aspects and ecological aspects within that. In Uruguay, we're trying to work on electrifying transport and energy efficiency in a number of sectors of industry. In that respect, in principle, we have a slightly critical position. The concept of inclusive societies, to me, implies that there has to be a social component. And in the beginning, when the initiative was presented to us, there was a very strong focus on investment. For us, investment is important, but it must also include this social or participatory component, a localized, regionalized part of the initiative. And in that posture, we have trust in Europe, so we need to begin an exchange on that. And we must, at least in our country, manage to ensure that some of the resources in this initiative should be devoted to citizen participation and social development. And I think this is a way in which we can mutually learn, because Europe isn't perfect here either. And then lastly, there has to be a strong emphasis on the impact that this alliance should have on citizenship, as Luis emphasized. This public dimension must put people in the center with a social focus, and that must lead to more and better access to public services, improving the quality of life and the dignity of our citizens. Public policies need to promote the sharing of best practice. This is a good result for both continents, learning from experience. Working with civil society means that public policy cannot be done without a citizen dialogue. We must work with people more and better. In this respect, when it comes to international cooperation for Uruguay, we've created decentralized cooperation with on-the-ground cooperation involving civil society on key issues in the planning, implementation and monitoring of any public policy. And this allows a horizontal approach, building mutual trust, something mentioned earlier. If we manage to deepen it like that, then mutual benefit, a horizontal approach and benefits for each region will ensure that we have a much better success rate in building this long-term vision. We must turn opportunities into real achievements. There must be strong arrangements for cooperation. We must work together to create this just and sustainable future.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much. Thank you for deepening the discussion. I would like to give Luis the floor once again. Perhaps you could give the perspective of UNAMOS. What opportunities might there be in this strengthened partnership that could boost the economic situation, that could perhaps strengthen civic spaces and create greater solidarity with groups that fight for freedom and justice in Nicaragua? Well, I'd like to start by saying that Uruguay finds itself in quite a unique position in Latin America because they're always pioneers in political will, in democratic progress, and the rest of the region trails behind. It's a little bit more complicated for us. Chile also is similar in that respect. And I wanted to give a more Central American perspective, when we talk about Latin America, we think more about the South as an example. And we believe that it's important to strengthen something that's happening in Central America, in Nicaragua. There is a dictatorship in El Salvador. There's a very authoritarian government in Costa Rica. There's been backsliding as well. And so it's important to strengthen democratic institutions in this part of the world, because this will help us in any kind of trade relationship. But by consolidating democracies that are very weak at the moment, we will be able to promote transparency, which is key in a region in which corruption is rife. Promoting human rights is something we sometimes take for granted, but at the moment we're facing a regional and even an international landscape in which people's human rights are being challenged, citizens' human rights are being questioned. We can't talk about the economy or trade relationships when our citizens are fighting for their freedom and to build societies that allow them to be free and to feel fulfilled. And so I wanted to highlight those aspects which I think are crucial from my own personal perspective, because exchanges are important for that as well. We need to respect human dignity and the human rights of all citizens. So it seems basic when establishing a trade relationship between the EU and Latin America.
Thank you very much for these further reflections about how this relationship should take into account also other considerations. I'd like to turn back to you, Hannah. So having heard a bit what the colleagues have said, but also take into account maybe the recent report that was the AFET report on the EU political strategy on Latin America. And, you know, more in general, can you share with us also what you would see really being the main benefits and opportunities of these stronger ties, trade and development ties between Europe and Latin America?
Thank you. Bueno, este último informe...
This most recent report, we think, is pretty pertinent. I'd like to emphasize here that Javi Lopez is the rapporteur who has done some tremendous work here, but it was led by the EPP. Now, he was chairing Eurolatin in the last parliamentary term. He knows the region well. This inform sets out specific priorities that will be important, such as the strategic alliance with Latin America, dialogue and cooperation. Above and beyond partnership, above and beyond that partnership, security partnership, fighting drugs, justice and human rights, the rule of law are dealt with as priorities that are basic ones for us. And of course, we must stress the relevance of political cooperation with Latin America. That's the impetus that we want from Europe. As you can see, the last Eurolac summit was here and it will be coming up in Colombia, and it covers it's about 6 or 7 years since we held the last one, which isn't a good sign, and I think it needs to be more frequent. We've had some success in recent years. Last year, as you know, in the last parliamentary term, we had Josep Borrell as the High Representative. He spent a lot of time and energy on Latin America and ensuring that it was always at the top of the agenda for the European External Action Service, now led by Mrs. Callas. So, as you can understand, a political agreement is needed to deal with the planetary challenges. And for Spain, Africa is very close, but Latin America is always at the top of our agenda. This was our priority when we had Josep Borrell as the High Representative, but the current incumbent comes from Eastern Europe, and that is something that puts a bit of pressure on the situation when it comes to relations with Latin America. What's important is to keep step with what's going on in Latin America. We have some major issues together. Brazil is a motor behind change and fundamental for us in terms of future integration in Latin America. And then we've seen changes of leadership in the world. And of course the country's economy is transforming, and that's vital for the region too. There's an election year and we'll have to see what's going on there. In terms of Uruguay, that doesn't really count because everything is going well in Uruguay. It's like a democratic island in the world and an example of this idea of joint fronts in the world. We're delighted that Uruguay is there, but we shouldn't take it for granted, of course. It has this super advantage. Uruguay may proceed slowly, but gets everyone's agreement on board, and I think that's worth the effort. And I think it's a good example. In general terms, there is a very consolidated external dimension to economic relations with Latin America, based on multilateralism, and above all, in Latin America, it's equal to equal, peer-to-peer relationship with the European Union and Latin America, hand in hand. Relations with other countries have to be based on equality, because if we think back to our history, especially in Europe, it hasn't always been very generous in that dimension. So I think that's what we've got to think of. Latin America is a continent with a lot of its own personality, and it's important to advance together, hand in hand. And of course, we're in using the fact that the current Secretary General in the UN body is a female from Latin America. And last week in the UN week in the General Assembly, it was good to see female as Secretary General, and I think that's something that we should go for. It would be good to see that. We need to ensure there's political impetus there. There are agreements with Mexico, Chile and Mercosur as fundamental pillars here, but I think we need a political initiative here. That's got to be a priority, the relationship with Latin America. Thank you.
Gracias. Quisiera ahora
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to give the public the opportunity to ask questions to our excellent panelists. Let's see how many questions we can gather. We have a good amount of time for this question and answer session. I would ask you to introduce yourselves briefly, telling us your name and your organization. Please make your questions brief and concise, and if you want to address your question or comment to a particular panelist, then please state that. Who would like the floor?
Then, if there's no one, I have one. but then I give you first to Leire, but I also have few
A ver,
others that I'd like to ask, but
thank
Leire, please go ahead.
Thank you so much. Aprovechando que tenemos aquí a
Taking advantage of the fact that we have colleagues here from Latin America, and we want to hear their views and strengthen the relationship with them. Hannah talked about the expectations that we have and the next few dates we have in the diary to improve our strategic relationship. We have a shared agenda, the CELAC summit in Colombia, and then the COP30 in Brazil, which is key. Then we have another set of multilateral meetings. So I wanted to ask the colleagues from the region, what are your specific expectations surrounding that cooperation with the EU, with these events coming up? What are the most important points that you think need to be taken into account?
Veo que hay otra
I see that there is another question from the floor. Yes, hello, good morning. I'm Diana Barreto, and I am from the Montevideo organization in Uruguay, and I wanted to ask a question about the EU-Mercosur agreement, and taking advantage of the fact that Hannah is here, I also wanted to thank the entire panel for their comments. Mercosur exports to the EU over 80% raw materials and buys from the EU over 80% of products that have been processed in some way or another. And so the Mercosur agreement establishes the rules for trade. Then there are chapters on cooperation, which have more of a political, uncertain angle, which worries us. So how can we ensure that the agreement will contribute to fair development of the economies in Mercosur? So I'll respond very briefly. It's very interesting that you have asked that question by sectors, because the Commission has a page which has been updated recently. I would recommend you visit that, because it talks about the different economic sectors that are contained in the Mercosur agreement. Then we have to ask ourselves whether it will be voted on or not. The trade part will be voted on, because that is the competence of the EU. So that needs to have a qualified majority. We believe it will achieve that. We know that some of the delegations of some countries are a little bit more reluctant to the Mercosur when it comes to the Mercosur agreement, because they're concerned about certain sectors. We had a meeting with Leire and DG Trade a few days ago about the different sectors, the cost-benefit relationship, and obviously both continents will benefit from this agreement. But I would recommend you visit the website, because DG Trade publishes all the details related to this. So the trade part would be subject to a qualified majority and would need to be voted on in the Council. I am hopeful that it will go through. We will work hard for that to happen. And then the political part will need to be ratified in the national parliament. So that's a different situation altogether. I think there are a lot of people here who are very in favor of Mercosur, and there are lots of trade agreements that have been in place for a while. We've had this with Mexico, with CETA, and there were people quite afraid at the beginning. They thought it wouldn't work. Then, when they are actually implemented, we see how those countries which were most fearful have benefited the most. I think, this is my personal opinion, that we ratify the trade part first, and then when people see the benefits of this, the political side will also be ratified as well. I'm very certain that that's what will happen. Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. Maybe Martín or Luis could address Leire's question on your country's expectations regarding the next few international events that we'll be taking part in, starting with the EU CELAC summit in Santa Marta and then COP30 as well.
Empiezo yo rapidito, Marta.
Well, if I just get in ahead, Latin America is a complex place, and I think that we can all agree on. And of course, that's an additional factor. In terms of the Santa Marta summit, there will be the capability of political dialogue there that can exist, and of course, we'll look at the shared expectations that Latin Americans have. I think this is pretty key, this political event. In terms of the expectations, the more general expectations, I think there's quite a lot about sustainable investment and the strengthening of democracy in the region, and I believe that at the same time a fairly decisive role will be what Anna said, that Latin America needs political change in the region, which will play a driving role. We know there's this whole electoral process going on in the region which could determine the future of the agreement.
Martin.
Bueno,
Well, as regards what you were saying, we need to take into account what Lewis has mentioned. Above and beyond the content of the EU CELAC summit, which I think is important, the content, I tend to think that a little more about trade will be in it, but also more political content. I do think that here what's important is firstly to understand that our region is a fragmented one, and I say that in complete sincerity. Health is an issue. How do we cope without vaccines at a time of pandemic, for example, was one question that's been raised. A lot depends, as has been said, on the election process underway in the region over the next few months. But another factor will be that we need to build in the involvement of the people. The people need to know what the EU Latin America agreement's all about. Otherwise, it's going to be politicians and technocrats and Parliament sidelined, and people not knowing, therefore, what is needed on the ground by ordinary people. Some areas may be more sensitive in terms of a trade agreement than others in each country, and the states involved need to have public policies that can relieve the pressure on those sectors opened up by trade cooperation. Now, of course, I defend free trade, but there must be conditions in place so that when trade opening takes place, there is that protection. There needs to be an involvement of the people regionally. That's why we have international cooperation. Sometimes there's no answer to this. People need to feel some ownership over this process that's going on. I think it's important to work with people on these topics and to ensure that there's participation in making a decision rather than bringing them in afterwards. I think there's a challenge there. in terms of the political content of that summit, I think that needs to be taken into account. This is a fairly complex region, as has been said. And I think there needs to be that commitment at country level to do these things. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I will turn back to the room, to the floor for further questions. This is an opportunity to speak and listen among comrades, with comrades from Latin America. And so I open the floor for comments or interaction with our panelists. Does anyone have a question?
Si no, yo tengo
If not, I do have one.
in English. Of course, here we are talking about Europe and Latin American relationship. But this relationship do not, we already mentioned, do not happen in a bubble, right? It happens in a context where, of course, there are other big actors, like China, for example. We talked about raw materials. Also, China is trying to establish and sign different contracts and agreements, to access the raw material in Latin America, or to establish other type of connection and partnership. I always wonder what makes the European offer of model of partnership more interesting for Latin American countries in relation to other actors that also they have their economic interest and trying to establish then also this economic relationship with Latin America. I'm very curious to hear, your perspective, because we as Europeans, we say, oh, we are the best. We bring, agreements that have values. We're not just about money. Is this what, do you agree with that? Do you see concretely this? And do you think that this is the good argument? I'm asking this also as civil society organization, right? When we talk about, the good model, what is the good model and why Europe offer should be more interesting for your countries than other offers. Thank you. So maybe Martin, would you like to start?
Bueno, interesante la pregunta.
That's an interesting question. First of all, we need to take into account how we have come to reach these agreements with the EU. It's taken over 20 years. There have been steps forward and steps back. And I think the geopolitical situation has helped things along at this point in time. There are trade wars, there's political uncertainty, a multilateral crisis. We're calling into question the legitimacy of political parties. Democracy is being called into question as well. And I think against this backdrop, the conditions have emerged for this relationship to be strengthened, because the EU also finds itself at a political crossroads in the same way that Latin America does. And so that's why I think these agreements have been consolidated at this point in time. But at the same time, I think we have a shared history. Beyond what Hannah said earlier on, we share values and principles, democratic principles. We defend human rights. We believe in the principles of international law. So I think a number of elements have come together which have helped this agreement to prosper. But I would continue to highlight the need to keep taking part in this dialogue and creating spaces for exchanges, not just between governments, but also between members of civil society, local governments. After the economic agreement is ratified, we're going to need technical cooperation for the implementation of these agreements. At least in my country, this is a discussion that we've had with IMPA on the morning before coming here. So in response to your question, I think a number of factors have come together, geopolitical factors and related to the current circumstances, which have led to this agreement taking root so that both regions can now defend the same thing.
Much. Luis, would you like to comment on
Sí,
that?
sí, yo básico. No sé quién decía.
Yes, I'll be very brief. I don't know who said yesterday that if the EU had seen this just as a free trade treaty, then perhaps this wouldn't have happened. And in the case of Central America, we need to consider the perspective that has come with the political dialogue. For example, one of the main mineral resources in the region is gold. And a few weeks ago, I read how Nicaragua, El Salvador, Guatemala, Chinese and Canadian companies have come just to negotiate and take control of the main gold mines and control them as much as possible, that without taking into account the environmental impact. And the government in power hasn't really batted an eyelid. And I think the approach that the EU has is completely different. Its perspective is totally different. Its idea is to strengthen us. But there are also things that we have in Latin America that are good for the EU. So I just wanted to add that and not repeat anything that's been said already. I also wanted to remind you that political dialogue between both regions started again in 2022, 2023 in the CELAC summit in Brussels. That political dialogue started again, and that triggered the negotiations and political coordination between the different parliaments. But there had been a period of us being part of quite a cold relationship from a political perspective. I'll just make a very brief comment. We believe that trade with China is a threat. Obviously, it's brought a lot of benefits to Latin America, but it's a very different approach to ours. We're looking for an approach based on, or a relationship based on, more sustainable development. And I'm not just referring to our relationship with Latin America. The Chinese have been in Latin America for a long time. I think a high percentage of trade in Latin America happens with China, but we're realizing this quite late on, actually.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Before we conclude this session, I'd like to welcome Daniel Parado, the ambassador of Mexico here in Belgium, and thank our panelists
Of this session. So thank you, our panelists, thank you, the participants for the question and the discussion. So a big round of applause for our panelists. Now we're going to have 10 minutes coffee break before we start the next session of this morning. Muchísimas gracias.
Un placer.
Verdaderamente un gusto. O sea, ¿se va a quedar aquí por algunos días? ¿Todavía algunos días?
Mañana voy al Congreso del PES.
Ah, claro, como mucho, claro. Sí. Va a estar allí mi secretario general, Mike. ¿Tú vas a ir al Congreso del PES también?
Sí, estoy ahí
claro.
mañana.
Michael, vas a ver a Michael allí. Va a estar
Ahí
saliendo ahora. Muchísimas gracias, Ana.
A ti, mi amor, yo me siento abajo.
Estupendo.
Quedemos en contacto. Me gustaría quedar en contacto contigo.
Con muchísimo gusto. Nosotros, mira, vamos a... Ustedes... To you. I hope you enjoy.
Absolutely, it was very good.
Really,
Yeah,
great.
pleasure.
Are you based in...
Yes, I'm based in Brussels.
Never see each other.
No, I've only arrived in November, and I'm heading our team for EU funding. So
So you work on MFF IMF.
Exactly,
And
yeah. And I'm also the chair, the president of ENOP, the European Network of Political Foundations.
Okay,
Yeah. So, but I'm around.
we're about to publish our briefing now on the NFS. I mean,
Yeah.
we have done.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll ask Daniela your contact details.
Yeah,
so maybe
I can give you my card as well. Yeah, if you
Super,
want.
I don't
That
have.
would
I
be
don't
great.
have.
Yeah, but I'll get it for you.
Super,
Thanks.
you.
Ciao cara, ciao cara. Va, quando lasciamo perdere, no? Si riempiono la bocca di sviluppo sostenibile e poi quando si tratta di...
Ah, ok. Cioè io adesso devo fare una roba che devo chiedere, perché io praticamente cioè, quando facciamo delle sono abbastanza maciato per la prima presentazione, chiamo tutti per nome, però mi sento a disagio da calabrese che sono con Mercadante, perché un po' l'età, un po'. Quindi io vi chiamo tutti Miss e Mister, quindi ti devo chiamare Miss Crafta, oppure chiamo tutti per nome. Quindi adesso io vado a dire a Mercadante, senti, mi ti chiamo per nome, tutto a posto, lo vado a chiedere. No, perché non posso fare una, cioè non posso, capito, che è lui di Pagliere, a lui diverso, a voi diverso, capito, deve essere uguale.
Ho capito l'imbarazzo.
Hai capito? Vabbè, niente, queste sono le mie pippe mentali, capito, nella moderazione, perché lo vorrei chiamare. Hello, hello. We are about to restart. We are about to start with the second exciting session of the day. So I'd like to kindly invite everyone to take their seats and my distinguished speakers to join me on the panel. So the second session is called A New EU-LAC Cooperation for Trade and Sustainable Development. And I'm very happy to be joined by our distinguished group of speakers that I will introduce in the order in which they will take the floor. So, starting from my right, so Kathleen van Brempt, member of the European Parliament from the S&D Group, S&D Vice President and Vice Chair of the International Trade Committee. Moving on my left, Marita Gonzalez, member of the International Relations Secretary at the General Confederation of Labor Argentina. And turning back to my right, Elena Krasta, Senior Advisor on Trade, External Relation at the European Trade Union Confederation. Turning back to my left, Aloisio Mercadante, President of the Brazilian Development Bank. So the main point that we want to discuss together with our panelists and our participants in this session, it's about how can both regions ensure the trade agreement foster inclusive growth and align with sustainable development goals. It's good to repeat, sustainable development goals are still there with us until 2030 at least. Second question we'd like to ask is in what ways can EU-Latin American cooperation contribute to a fairer and more rule-based global trade system? They're very challenging questions, but I like to immediately start discussing them. And actually, I like to ask all our panelists to reflect on the first question or the first point of this panel. So about how this trade agreement can really foster inclusive growth and align with sustainable development goals. And I'd like to start from you, Kathleen, if you'd like to start sharing, your views on this connection. You've been working a lot and reflecting a lot on this and doing a lot of work on these connections. Of course, in very different contexts, and things now are not easier than they were a few years ago. So looking very much forward to hearing from you. You have 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Barbara, and well, happy to see all of you. And I've heard you already had a very interesting program, and that I think is very important. It's important that we meet up also in physical presence, and we have frank and open discussions also amongst people that think very much alike, but come from different parts of the world. And thinking very much alike is one of the key issues these days. I have to tell you something personal. I've been engaged in the European Parliament for more than 10 years, mainly on climate and energy. So I was in the ITRE and the ENVI committee. And now 6 years ago, I decided to change my portfolio into trade. Many people said, what are you going to do in trade? Well, I said, well, everything that I've been engaged in sustainability, putting that as one of the main focuses in trade. And that's what happened 6 years ago. It was also today, trade is a very interesting portfolio and in the middle of all these discussions. But 5-6 years ago, it was all about the Green Deal, remember? We established a full Green Deal agenda, and part of it very much focused also on trade. Let me give you two examples that are still very relevant today when we talk about, for instance, the Mercosur agreement. I'll come to that in a second, because I think the Mercosur agreement is a very relevant agreement to assess the actual situation today. But 5 to 6 years ago, in the beginning of the former term, it was also there, and sustainability was top of the agenda. And within the full Green Deal agenda, oh, slow down. I will slow down, sorry, to the interpreters. I should know that, I've been around so long. But I want to tell so much and I don't want to take too much of the time, but still. Let me give 2 examples of that green agenda. The first is the TSD chapter within the trade agreements. You know, trade agreements, very important. Europe is leading on these issues, and a trade agreement, it is called a free trade agreement, but it's actually a wrong name. It should be a regulated trade agreement, because what you do is you do not just take the international rules, you adjust your trading relation on a set of, well, basic principles, norms and values that we share. And the Trade and Sustainability Agenda chapter, is a very important part of that trade agreement. And what we did in the last term, we changed that TSD chapter into a more enforceable chapter, being at the equal level of all the other chapters and making it sanction-based. One of the best examples is the trade agreement with New Zealand, where you can see that the TSD chapter is a sustainable chapter that is enforceable and sanction-based. A second example is, for instance, the deforestation regulation. And of course, I mention it because it's very, very important today as well, being under attack, like every aspect of the Green Deal now is under attack in the new geopolitical situation and the new political situation in the European Parliament. Today, at that time, you might remember, we have put in the European Parliament the Mercosur agreement in what we call the freezer. We said we're not going to vote on the Mercosur agreement because it doesn't give us enough guarantee that the TSD chapter is what it should be, and it doesn't give us enough guarantee that that agreement will not foster deforestation in, for instance, Brazil. That was the situation 5 years ago. Since then, the world has changed dramatically. I don't have to explain that, for sure. You have been discussing that in length already. The war in Ukraine and the Trump administration, and both are very, very important in the new geopolitics. We are in the midst of a trade war with the United States, although we have settled in some sort of agreement. I'm not going to discuss that today. But we still are in a very tense situation, and so is the rest of the world. And then when you look at the Mercosur agreement that has been renegotiated, the Paris Agreement is now an essential element, which is very important. You have to, as I said, trade is not a tool as itself. It is a means to achieve something. And in this sense, I think it is important that we look at the Mercosur agreement in the new context, and that always has been, although it's not always a regime that we like. If Bolsonaro is in charge of Brazil, we were very much arguing against that regime. But Brazil is, together with Argentina and the other Mercosur countries, a very important partner for us. And in that new geopolitics, it is more important than ever. Having said that, I think it's very important that we connect the different dots and that we cooperate very closely together, because the TSD chapter within the Mercosur agreement is not a sanction-based one, it's not a modern one, but I think we can work with it. And for that, it's important to open up and keep open the very important dialogue that we have with the Mercosur countries, and Brazil in this case in particular. So it's a plea both to not let go our sustainability agenda, although very much under attack in this new constellation. I don't have to explain that to you, you all know that. So we as socialists and democrats, we have to keep up the high level of sustainability in whatever we do, in the broad sense. It also includes, of course, labor issues and the core conventions of the ILO. So to keep that up, but we are not working in a vacuum. The new geopolitics makes it very necessary that we both keep up the sustainability agenda and be very, well, let's say, pragmatic in how we deal with the trade agenda. My last point, but I think we will come to that, is what is really frightening, of course, is that the full international trade is under attack, and that today the WTO is considered to be, well, of no importance. If you look to what's happening with the trade agenda of the Trump administration, you see that there is no international rules-based trading system anymore, and I think Europe needs to lead on that issue as well. And for that, a very good and close cooperation with the full countries of Latin America is key in that.
Thank you very much, Kathleen, for this very inspiring preliminary points. I'd like to move to you, Marita, compañera, for some reflections on the same, question, right? So the connection, so how this trade relation could, contribute to inclusive growth and the SDG, so the Sustainable Development Goals. Marita.
Bueno, muchas gracias por la invitación.
Thank you very much for inviting me here. Yesterday and today, we've heard about a lot of the positive elements like the EU-Mercosur agreement, and as a trade union movement, and as coordinator of the Southern Cone, we have been following up on the different versions of the Mercosur agreement. We've talked about the differences between the 2009 version and the current version, and how policies for stopping deforestation and conditions for livestock farming have been included. These are related to the S15 goal on land systems. We also need to consider climate change, that's related to S13. But 7 of the SDGs are actually related to the rest of the agreement. They're also important, and they are cross-cutting and crucial. So we could say that we believe in these kinds of agreements. We want to develop ties for the inclusive development between the EU and Latin America, and Mercosur in particular, but this agreement is insufficient in order to ensure inclusive development. And it focuses on natural resources for Latin America and South America, but what we have here is an oligopolization, a monopoly, and in particular, we depend on fertilizers. There are agri-toxins, pesticides that come from the EU, and there are no actual restrictions on applying those on our livestock farming and agricultural sector. So that creates an imbalance in relation to Goal 17, because trade has to be balanced and has to support developing countries. We don't see here how this agreement generates greater diversification in the agricultural or industrial sector for countries like Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay. There have been some safeguard clauses with regard to Paraguay and Uruguay, and with regard to public procurement. But if we consider SDG 11, which is related to infrastructure or resilient cities, Martín from Uruguay already explained the cooperation model that exists between EU and Latin America regarding inclusive cities. However, there could be a greater contribution to the energy transition, hybrid transport, electric transport. But from what we've seen during the first few years is that there'll be a significant reduction in Argentina to our fleet of cars, to the stock of cars, and that will affect the industrial sector. So when it comes to the goals, I also wanted to focus on 8, which is decent work. These agreements can create jobs, but how to ensure that those jobs fulfill the condition of decent work and that they're linked to increase social protections based on collective bargaining and sector-based bargaining. How can we ensure that studies are undertaken in the EU to determine the impact and that they're not undertaken in the Mercosur countries? When it comes to the impact studies, we've seen that specialized production, at least in the first few years, will require reconversion, and that will depend a lot on the global gateway, but also on the political pillar. Policies will need to be approved by governments here in the EU. And if we look at comparative agreements with Central America or Chile, we need to consider when that part of the agreement will be approved. So we are concerned about those parts of the agreement, even though we've been told on numerous occasions that there will be sections on cooperation. We're still waiting for certainty on the fact that the political part will be developed in parallel. There will be impact analysis undertaken, and that transparency will be defined. When it comes to SDG 17, inclusive alliances, we need to focus on sustainable development because there should be a subcommittee with participation of civil society. We've also talked about the supply chain, about other bodies, but we haven't discussed trade unions, who are a central part of social dialogue. The ILO was established in 1919, but it hasn't been mentioned yet. We're the ones who can the only ones who can undertake a sector analysis on how this agreement will impact work. We need to understand whether that productivity gap can really be closed and understand the role, the economic and social role of Europe, which is quite clear. The Economic and Social Forum makes recommendations and has a similar role, and it's never mentioned. This is a tripartite environment where NGOs take part in the social solidarity and people's economy that doesn't appear in the agreement. So we want to know what's going to happen with family-based agriculture. We'll also need to talk to trade unions in general, not just industrialists. It also mentions the impact on Brazil, but we need to consider developing economies and what will happen to employment in Paraguay and in Uruguay. And I'm also concerned that in Argentina, civil rights are being undermined, social and political rights are being undermined every day. They're being violated because we have a far-right government that is destroying democracy. Thank you.
Marita, para llevarnos esta perspectiva sindical.
Thank you for that trade union perspective, Marita. Seen from Argentina, more widely from Latin America, and now, on my right, we will hear from the trade union perspective on the same question, and I'll give the floor to Elena Krasta from the European Trade Union Confederation.
Thank you. I will switch to English to mix things up a bit. I think that from the perspective of the ETUC representing workers in Europe, the position when it comes to international trade is fairly clear. We want a rights-based trade policy that benefits workers as much as offering opportunities for companies to grow and make profits. We don't like the differential treatment that workers' interests are often treated with. We have appreciated, just to use the Mercosur agreement as an example, we have appreciated the elevation of the Paris Agreement as an essential element. But the question is, if you can do it for the trees of the forests, why can't you do it for the interest of working people? And so we'd like the same determination to elevate the standards when it comes also to working people. I'm now going to try to answer the question, which is how can trade agreement foster inclusive growth? And again, for us, inclusive growth relies on the creation of decent work. Firstly, we would say that we must put sustainability and rights at the core of trade agreements. That means, as Kathleen mentioned, enforceable trade and sustainable development chapters with clear obligations, but also the identification of supporting measures. We don't expect partner countries to start from the same standpoint as we do in Europe. We have to appreciate this. And the differential treatment that this warrants is absolutely key as a starting point of a relationship that has to be based on treating partners as peers at the same level. We also believe that, again, to balance the interest and the protection of the actors involved in a trade partnership, we need to remove the privileges of private investors, because the mechanisms like investor-state dispute systems or the new permutation, ICS as it's called, they give private investors access to a level of private justice that, again, workers who suffer from labor violations are not, have no equivalent to. Thirdly, we think we need to hardwire democratic participation and accountability and transparency in these trade agreements. So it's very critical that we establish independent domestic advisory groups that have a balanced representation of interest. 3 groups: civil society, employers, and trade unions. Not overwhelming representation of business interest, not representation of organizations handpicked by the governments in partner countries. And these are just examples of our experience of the use of domestic advisory groups. And also giving this domestic advisory group a standing mandate to monitor all chapters, not just the trade and sustainable development chapters in an agreement. Because you'll find that the trade in service chapter or the investment chapter have a bearing on working conditions just as much as a TSD chapter. We also think that there should be free, prior, and informed consent for any projects that affect local community. And a lot is said about reindustrialization, but we think, and also access to critical raw materials, as we've heard in the previous panel, but we must shift from an extractivist stance to a value-adding stance. And much of this value addition also has to happen in the partner countries. We have a joint objective to green our economies. I think that's accepted. And we should develop joint green industrial value chains ranging from renewables, energy efficiency, circular economy. And at the core of this, we also must put skills and training strategies, again, with an objective to create quality jobs, including for underrepresented groups. This morning we mentioned as well the Global Gateway. Yes, it's an instrument. I'm not denigrating it, but again, where are the just transition goals of the project supported by the Global Gateway's guarantees or loans? We want to have impact assessment, environmental impact assessments, social impact assessments. Are the rights improved? Is the quality of jobs created measurable? Is it there? Because otherwise we're just providing public guarantees of European taxpayers and privatizing the project, the profits that the companies who receive these guarantees will accrue. And lastly, I think it's very important to also talk about redistribution of the positive effects of trading relationships. No one is here to deny the benefits of trade, but the problem that has led to today's geopolitical environment is that those benefits have not been equally shared. And then people end up voting for parties and presidents that espouse a certain vision of trade, that relies on protectionism, that relies on closing up the borders. And so the redistribution of wealth and linking the trade benefits to, for instance, social protection, yes, a universal public social protection, formalizing the employment relationship, adequately financing labor inspectorates, for instance, or simply providing the public authorities have the necessary resources to monitor the collection of taxes, that due diligence and environmental standards are respected, and basically allowing the states to play their role to protect their citizens and communities. Finally, a link to finance and the policy coherence. I think this is a debate that goes beyond the trade relationship as such, but is very much about debt relief and restructuring of debts. That's very important. Again, it's important to ensure that trading partners have the ability to sustain themselves, and also on our side to include development finance and traditional cooperation instruments in our next European budget. I'll conclude here. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. I will, for time management, I will not make any comment, just say so inspiring really to listen to you all. And I'm sure it's going to be also very inspiring to hear what you, Mr. Mercadante, have to say about this relationship from your special position and your role in the Brazilian Development Bank. So I'll give you the floor.
Queria, em primeiro lugar, saudar.
I'm going to speak in Portuguese once again. I could speak in Spanish, but I think would it be better to try and speak Spanish or a mixture of Portuguese and Spanish? Well, first of all, I wanted to start by thanking Hannah for her invitation to this event. She's always been an important leader in the relationship between EU and Latin America. Maria João coordinates the Progressive Foundation, and we are very interested in all her initiatives. Cecilia Nicolina here represents Barlasur. I was the president of Barlasur, and I am very fond of this particular institution. Maria was the Chilean defense minister. Luis Nunes Pereira was the Minister of Justice of Brazil and a very important senator in the history of Brazilian democracy. He's working here in FEPS, which is the institution that promotes exports and international trade with Brazil. So I'm going to start with a theological perspective. In 1655, there was a sermon given which talked about the relationship between those who were thin and those who were strong, and talked about how law would free them all. And in international trade, freedom oppresses people. It oppresses the strong versus the weak. If anyone has any difficulty understanding this, just take a look at the news. There isn't a tariff war, there's a tariff attack going on that is being waged by Trump. It is an authoritarian way of working. We had a trade deficit of $401 billion between Brazil and the US since 2009. And there was a 50% added tariffs on that, and we have always defended the independence of the judicial system. We have always defended the Brazilian democracy, and that is something that is non-negotiable for us. When we spoke to the World Trade Organization, this was considered unthinkable. We had a dispute with the US on cotton. And they offered subsidies for cotton, and we were able to choose any sector to fight against the US economy, to rebalance trade. So then the World Trade Organization is an instrument for developing countries, for Africa, for Latin America, for the poorest countries, because it's a multilateral institution and it is organized based on a series of standards and principles and values, but with shared conditions. Conditionality is one of the main criteria for participation in the WTO. So it's an instrument to resolve trade disputes, and that balances out trade, the trade relationship between those who are strong and those who are weak. And we shouldn't think about the West in these terms. We shouldn't go back, because those 40 years have led to an economic decline in the West. We need to rethink the relationship between the state and the market. We need a state that is more creative, more focused on innovation and protecting natural resources, the environment. But there needs to be a constructive relationship between the market and the state. That's what's happening in China, and that's why it's a major driver of the global economy. So we don't need less of a role of the state. We need a different role in the state that works with the private sector, which encourages it, which attracts private investment, but also defends the environment, which defends workers' rights and ensures labor rights at the same time. This is the major challenge that we're facing right now. I believe that in this landscape, this political landscape with Trump, the Soviet Union, being the diplomatic state that it was, had a very questionable, and I'm being very open here because that's just the way I am, had a very questionable relationship with Trump. I accepted the different conditions, and if the WTO had intervened, then this wouldn't be the case. The situation wouldn't exist. So imagine how smaller countries are going to deal with the world in the way it is right now. There's a concern that we have. We export commodities, raw materials, and we have to take control of our industrial world, but we need policies for this. We can't reindustrialize Brazil with a very harsh approach. We need more innovation and investment and education, science and technology. So that's a historic challenge that we're facing in order to improve our regions. But if we reach a trade agreement between the EU and Mercosur, then we will cover a market of 700 million people with a GDP of 22 trillion. So that is a space where we will be setting up value chains in order to attract investments. More than half the investments in Brazil come from foreign countries, foreign companies. Some of the major industries in Brazil were set up 50, 60, 70 years ago. So we need to take risks. Yes, obviously risks exist. There will be tension. But the difference here is that there are different mechanisms available to us. There's the possibility of negotiating. Trade unions will be able to question different aspects of the agreement. And without an agreement, there is no space for all of this. There's no way to promote engagement and create innovative policies. So this agreement creates special conditions for the automotive sector. It mentions hybrid transport. There is some innovation included here as well. In Europe, there are quotas for exporting agricultural products. Europe is committed to 98% and to 92% of the market, respectively. But then there are a series of measures. The issue of the environment is key in this whole debate. You've talked a lot about the Green Deal. Every time I've come here, you've talked about the Green Deal. Now we're the ones demanding the Green Deal because we've reduced deforestation in the Amazon by 47%. My bank is financing the planting of trees. We've contributed 73 million to this, and our aim is to restore the Amazon because we understand that it's the best way to capture carbon. We have created a strategic policy center that has representation from all countries in the region, Europol, Ameripol, all the military and civil police coordinated by the federal police in Brazil. And the idea is to fight against illegal trafficking, logging, and mining. Today we have photographed the mining that is being undertaken. We do this from the air, and we've noticed that we've been able to recover a huge amount of land that was subject to illegal mining. The police have also developed a DNA for gold. We are then able to establish exactly where gold has come from, where it's been mined illegally. So that we cannot combat illegal activity without bringing together the different security forces. We are facing a crisis which is authoritarian unilateralism. The answer to this is more partnerships, more multilateralisms, more cooperation and dialogue. And we hope that the European Union will be braver, bolder, will take a firmer stance and respect the principles that have built this crucial center for diplomacy in order to fight against this unilateral phenomenon. I took part in the drafting of the different versions of the Mercosur agreement, and I very much appreciate trade unions. I understand their role in establishing conditions, and I believe that they should be present in the agreements. But multilateral agreements are important. We're going to sign this now in December, and we're going to respond to Trump from the EU and from Mercosur by deepening our trade relationship. We don't want a world in which the strong rule everything and the weak just have to submit to that. We already had that the relationship between the strong and the weak is oppressed with freedom. It's law, it's the law, it's rights that will free people. So that relationship between the EU and Mercosur is very important from a political perspective. It's important because it will help to rebuild multilateralism. I think the Global South, the BRIC countries, will take the initiative in the future. And I'd like to finish with one particular detail. When we came to the government in 2012, the trade between Brazil and China represented $4 billion. And between the US and China, it was $24 billion. Between Brazil and the EU, the figure was 32 million. So 4, 24, 32. The EU with 32 billion was our first partner. When we left government, then it was around 80 million with the US, 95 with the EU, and China 150 billion. That was the trade figure. So we're facing this challenge. We need to consider how to deal with this competitiveness that comes from China. It's better to have them as our allies than have them outside. It's better to have a trade agreement with them than have to work with this huge deficit caused by technological innovation. And so how are we supposed to continue? Wouldn't it be better to have an agreement between Brazil and the EU, between the EU and Mercosur? So in the Mercosur agreement, there's a lot of asymmetry between Paraguay and Uruguay, Brazil and Argentina, which is why we have a compensation fund to reduce that discrepancy. Brazil and Argentina supply more resources. Paraguay and Uruguay have more rights. And these compensatory mechanisms for establishing infrastructure, all of this is important. We want more of the global gateway in Latin America, more investment. We're going to build a stronger historical relationship, and it will be the strongest in the world because we have a democracy in the EU and Latin America, and together we will be stronger.
Thank you very much for those words. I will make it possible for the other panelists to follow up on this concept of the importance of multilateralism and rules, the rules which are there to protect the weakest and to ensure that multilateralism works in that direction. Kathleen, I'd like to give you the floor, and could you take 3 minutes, please? That would be excellent to keep some debating time in hand. And please share your thoughts on this matter. Thank you.
I will do that in 2 minutes, although the subject is so broad and important that we could take, I guess, a few hours for it. Everybody knows that multilateralism, and not just on trade, on the very broad concept of multilateralism and international rule, is so much under pressure that I'm quite convinced that the world as we knew it will not come back. And the question is, maybe every crisis has its opportunities. We need to start thinking about a completely new world order based on maybe new rules. And yes, let me go into the WTO, because the WTO and the international rules on trade based within the WTO concept, of course, wasn't perfect at all and had these shortcomings that led to, I think, partly the crisis as it stands today. I'm not so enthusiastic to give Trump too much credit, but we have to acknowledge that the first time that Trump was in his administration and began criticizing WTO, he was not completely wrong, because we now look a lot to what's happening in the United States, but we've been under a lot of pressure coming from China. Today we have a steel crisis. It's not, well, the 50% tariff of Trump doesn't help, but it's not because of the 50% Trump tariff that we are in this crisis. It's because of the dumping of steel coming mainly from China. And it illustrates the problem that we've been facing for more than 10 years now. Well, yeah, maybe since the beginning of this century. When China entered the WTO, we all thought it would go it would become a democracy, a rules-based, values-based society as we know it. We thought that would be the new model. It didn't happen. And we haven't had any WTO dealing with the fact that the Chinese economical system is not what is meant, of course, to have a good, how can I say that, to create wealth within China, but it also was a real threat and still is for our own economy and industry. And we haven't taken that up as Europe, together with what was once a good ally, the United States, and that led to where we are. Can I also remind everybody of us that during the Biden administration, they did not do anything to restore the confidence in the WTO. Well, on the contrary. So it would be easy to think this is only just a Trump issue. No, this isn't. The reluctance of the United States when it comes to international trade has been long-standing, and we in Europe haven't been able to find solutions. And I think that's the quest that we have now in front of us. Again, we need to do that with like-minded countries. Brazil is one of them, absolutely. But also Japan, Canada, Australia, and let's see how far we can walk with India. All of them, of course, want to have some sort of international system up and running, and I think we will have to reinvent that system.
Excellent, thank you so much. Marita, would you like to come? If you could stay within 3 minutes, that would be fantastic.
3 minutes is fantastic.
That's a lot.
Sí, bueno.
Yes. Well, the questions about the agreement, I'm convinced that this is about regulating, and that means certain rules, and clearly that's a way of moving towards a fairer trade. In that, it's not about now or about China. China being a dominating country in the region for some time now. And it's not just been about trade rules there, but also about peace in our regions. If you look at what's going on in the Caribbean, with the US taking ongoing action, it's not just a question of Trump. This has been a historic thing. So that's something that impacts. And of course, we now see a situation involving China. It's much better that they're in the WTO now. However, in terms of what I want to talk about, there's firstly an issue of democratic deficit in this agreement. We need to see more participation of political actors. What's the parlor source role? For example, it strikes me that it's very weak within the agreement. So that's one topic that I think is important if we're going to strengthen Mercosur. My fear is that what will happen is that this will harm integration. We've seen precedents of this. That is something that we've seen before. We need to ensure that we've got all the democratic institutions that we need. In Europe, there's a structural cohesion fund, and we need that for these countries like Uruguay and Paraguay, and the disparities within Argentina too. We need to ensure that there's more competition between our countries, but the only way we can save the Mercosur countries is by having more Mercosur. So we need that integration, and that agreement, this agreement, does that too. We need to ensure that capital is released under that agreement. We need to deepen trade with Brazil. That's clear too. Our countries, however, also have a right to an autonomous development model that allows us decent work, a social economy, just trade, improving value chains, a diversified value chain, quality jobs. These are our objectives, and we would like to ensure that we can begin this path. It's 25 years old now, goes back to 99, but we need to enhance the involvement in the debate and around it, of this monitoring. There needs to be targeted work, sector by sector, to ensure that this agreement leads to a fair distribution of the benefits and sustainable development. Thank you.
Very much. Very concrete proposal. Elena, I'll move to you for your last remarks on the point.
So very much agree with previous speakers who said that we need to rewrite the new trading paradigm, basically. We shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. The predictability of WTO rules needs to be preserved. We need to uphold the multilateral system as we know it. But we also have to recognize the shortcomings, the uneven distributional effect of the benefits of trade, and we need to put solution to those shortcomings. So very concretely, we suggest that the partnership should be based on obviously accepting a shared normative baseline with very core standards at the center. We mentioned the ILO, obviously the Paris Agreement is already there, but there are other standards as well. But critically important, all equally important, not one elevated to the status of essential elements and others parts not. Re-architect the investment pillar, so have even a sort of improved version of TSD chapters with sanctionable clauses and participation and accountability. We want a green industrial transformation, so with industrial alliances between the two regions, and local value creation and fair competition. We're all for local content clauses, amazingly enough, but current WTO rules forbid us from advocating for those. So again, that's another area where maybe we need to look at. Finally, we want to make finance serve the people and the planet. So again, a reset of the global gateway as is currently conceived, and tying the disbursement of the grants to due diligence compliance, with an annual public review with interested stakeholders. And we very much put trade unions at the center of this review, naturally. I mentioned earlier the reform of international financial institutions and debt forgiveness, and the preservation of the fiscal space of sovereign countries. We're all sovereign countries. It's not just the US that is sovereign, right? And we must remember that and protect that regulatory and fiscal space. A previous speaker had mentioned the safeguard of democracy and the civic space. That also is critically important to increase ownership and legitimacy of this partnership. And in terms of concrete tools, I think we want, as we said, the domestic advisory group, but also a multi-stakeholder mechanism to monitor the decisions, for instance, of the EU CELAC summits and participate in the follow-up of those decisions and those commitments. Scorecards, why not? Because otherwise you haven't got anything to measure against. And a sort of trade for sustainable development goals conditionalities, again, measured on the scorecards and how much trade can actually help delivering on the SDG goals. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much for being again, very concrete, have this great political vision and then come up with very concrete proposal. Mr. Mercadante, I turn to you for 30 seconds, kind of slogan intervention before I turn to the room for maybe just a couple of intervention, because then we'll have to go into the closing part of our panel. So Mr. Mercadante, over to you.
Caracciolo è nosso émissaire.
Caracciolo is our emissary. She's from the WTO, and I've talked a lot about justice, and at the end of the day, it's important for there to be rules and negotiations to resolve those kinds of conflicts and disputes. First of all, I wanted to say that the US is facing economic decline because in the last 40 years, it's had a different development plan, an industrial plan. It has comparative advantages, it has military power, but I think Trump is trying to reverse that trade deficit, which is long-standing, but it's destroying its soft power. It is undermining the value of the dollar, and it is actually harming citizens and its allies as well, which is unacceptable. The country has a deficit of $401 billion since 2009, shouldn't have tariffs of 40%, because we have a democracy that wants to condemn and punish those responsible for a military coup. So we have political prisoners, people who have been tortured, persecuted, and we have decided that we never again want a dictatorship. We are always going to defend the rule of law. And this is something that America perhaps doesn't understand. We need to respect our institutions and our citizens. That is a basic principle. This is something that is not allowed under WTO rules. And so we have to rebuild the WTO as well. I'm not going to talk too much about Trump because I don't have much time. I don't want to waste it on him. But at the end of the day, the relationship between Lula and Trump has a specific kind of chemistry. We're trying to negotiate with them and with the US in a rational way and defend the global South. And I am convinced of the historical relationship between the EU and Latin America. They are two democratic regions. We have two significant civilizations, and in the Mercosur agreement, we have an instrument to deepen our relationship. Europe has worked hard to get where it is, and I think we'll find better solutions together. There's no way back from this. We need to focus on better multilateralism. And I just wanted to make one comment about China. We have a huge trade surplus with China, but it's poor quality trade. It's very different than the relationship we have with the US, where we offer a lot of added value. With China, we also have an agenda. We don't really want to be aligned with them. We don't to be reliant on them. We want greater sovereignty and autonomy. But we do have certain relationships and partnerships with China at the end of the day. And finally, with regard to Mercosur and the democratic deficit, in Parliament in Mercosur. We have different priorities than the ones in the EU. There are limitations there, which is something we have to work on. But we've started the process. Before there was nothing. And now it's important that we strengthen Parlasur. The far right never was committed to Mercosur or to developing multilateralism. Now things have changed. The far right need to be defeated, and we need to build on popular democracy, on solidarity. We need more collaboration and less of a competitive advantage. So my suggestion for trade unions is that, well, the EU presented safeguard clauses, and we also have the right to present the same as Mercosur. So we need to send a letter to ministers stating that trade unions need to be a part of these agreements. And I think it would make things much more positive and constructive. I think it would be a major error to not have trade unions represented, because these agreements need to benefit workers as well. We need rules that are democratic and that have been discussed in a multilateral setting, and that is what will protect the world of work. And I go back to what Antonio Vieira and his contribution from 1950. That relationship between the strong and the weak is oppressed by freedom and and they are freed by law. And I very much believe in that sentiment. I am totally committed to the relationship between Mercosur and the EU.
Yes, for those inspiring words, never heard a more convincing ambassador of the Mercosur agreement, more eloquent and very convincing ambassador of the Mercosur agreement, I have to say. We are closing this session, but I think Anna Jalul wanted to add a few words before we thank our panelists.
No, I was so glad, and I think it was a luxury panel, and we are really very lucky to have people that understands, que entiende, comprende y defiende el Mercosur porque sabe lo que nos...
Who understand and defend Mercosur because they understand what's at stake and they understand the politics of the Latin American region. And Mr. Mercader is also has a strong relationship with trade unions, so that's the perfect combination. I wanted to ask a final question, if possible.
I'm afraid.
Then you have to tell me there's no time. Otherwise, you know. Entonces lo dejamos aquí.
So we end here? Okay.
Yo quería preguntar a los...
We talked about Global Gateway and the export of raw materials. How can we provide added value with Global Gateway in Latin America, and how will that affect far-right governments within the context of the Mercosur and EU agreement?
And I'd like now to welcome very much Maria Joao Rodriguez, President of the FEPS, to join here to the podium, while I would like really to extend our gratitude to our panelists for their very inspiring word. You can, yes, we can move and sit on the other side, or also we can stay. Welcome, Maria Joao. Please take a seat. So a big round of applause to our panelists. Welcome to the podium, Maria Joao. You can stay, actually. You can. Who will actually make the closing remarks for this morning event. And again, also thanks to the participant. And Maria Joao, the floor is yours for the final closing remarks.
Yeah, and I guess that have very few minutes, isn't it, to respect our interpreters. So that's why I will use English to be precise and quick. My function is not easy because this was a great conference starting yesterday. I'm supposed to make closing remarks about everything since yesterday, this morning. And so I will say basically the following. First of all, to underline the frank discussion we could have with high qualified speakers from both sides. Secondly, the high level of conclusions we can already identify. I would like, because I have very short time, to come with a central idea where I'm very happy that I'm intervening exactly in the direction of Eloísio Mercadante, so very good friend, to say that we are going to a moment where the historical relationship between Latin America and European Union must go to another level, must absolutely go to another level, because we are in a new world with a global disorder, but the new order being shaped. And so we need to be active and cooperating to shape the new global order. And if European Union and Latin America are together, we are powerful actors, able to shape the global order. I think we should use the summit coming in Santa Marta and all our relationship to push for 3 new objectives. One is about developing a real strategic partnership between the 2 blocks. This is trade agreement for sure. We need once and for all to approve the Mercosur agreement, but this is a comprehensive partnership. Second idea, we need to work to reform the multilateral system and to give a future to the multilateral system. And third, we need to have higher political coordination, because we have now a movement of ideas in the political action which is undermining multilateralism. I will call it the MAGA movement, so like that you understand what I'm referring to. I think these are 3 new objectives for the cooperation between progressive forces in the European Union side and the Latin American side. If I go into specific in a few minutes, when I refer a real strategic partnership, I'm saying for co-development. Really for co-development from the European side in Latin America. This means this is about trade with rules, but if we want to have trade with rules, we need to have much stronger cooperation on technological side, on making sure that all countries can count on industrial policy. Industrial policy was almost forbidden in the European Union until very recently. Now this is being accepted, but our partners in Latin America should also have their industrial policy, as Eloísio Mercadante referred to Brazil. Without these, standards will have difficulties to be respected. So we need to complement this with much higher cooperation, and the role of the Global Gateway can help a lot. Second objective, working together not only to support the multilateral system, because this multilateral system is not effective and is not fair and is not inclusive, is to reform the multilateral system. We had a great example coming from Brazil when Brazil was chairing the G20 and used the G20 to reform the United Nations system. Remarkable work done. European Union is also part of the G20. So we need really to translate what we have approved, called the Pact for the Future, in good decisions this year. We work together for financing for development and CV. We'll be together in the COP in Brazil for climate. And we are also working to reform the digital and AI governance. I'm very happy that we can also open this front on cooperation to shape the digital transition. There is the American model, there is the Chinese model, but we need to make sure that the European countries and the Latin American countries, they can make their own choices on the digital policy. This is also very important. And this brings me to the last objective, which is about political coordination. Because we have a very serious challenge, is that there is a new global order emerging, very much marked by a rivalry between great powers. Some of them are autocracies, but our world should not be run by autocracies. Our world should be run by democracies, taking care of people and planet. It's as simple as that. So this is a big historical battle, and this is where the alliance between Latin America and European Union can be so decisive, because we are based on democracies, on the rule of law, and we care for a multilateral governance. Again, I need to refer Brazil, because the reaction of Brazil to defend its democracy and the right to have democratic choices against something which was clearly a coup d'etat is an example for the world. We cannot accept interferences coming from the MAGA actors. They happen in Brazil, they are taking place here in some European countries. Right now, the European Union is under pressure. This is one of the reasons so far we have accepted this kind of trade deal. But you should know that progressive forces in Europe, they will negotiate in detail this trade deal to give more autonomy for the European choices. This is what is happening right now. So my call is, let's use this very good conference to elevate our coordination and to make sure that the summit coming in Santa Marta is the starting point for a powerful alliance, Latin America, European Union, working for co-development, working for a new multilateral system, and working for democracies conducting the future of the world instead of autocracies. And like that, I would like to close this conference, expressing our gratitude to all the speakers, and counting on us, we'll be together for the next chapters. Thank you very much.